After my daughter-in-law's surgery, I gave her a $4,000 wheelchair. At dinner, she looked me in the eye and said, "Keep the chair. I'd rather crawl than owe anything to a cheap old lady." Everyone laughed. The next day, my apartment's cameras showed me something that makes me glad you're here. Stick with my story until the end, and let me know what city you're from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. I'm 58, and I've lived long enough to know when someone is lying. But that night, as I watched my daughter-in-law, Jane, sitting in that $4,000 wheelchair I had gifted her, I didn't know I was looking at the most elaborate lie of my life. It all started 3 weeks ago when my son, David, called me from the hospital. His voice was shaky, worried in a way that gave me that familiar gut feeling every mother knows. "Mom, Jane needs back surgery. The doctors say she might be in a wheelchair for months, maybe forever." I didn't hesitate for a second. David is my only child, and even though Jane and I have never had the warmest relationship, she's the woman he loves. That same afternoon, I drove to the hospital with flowers and a promise that we'd do everything we could to help her. When I walked into the room, Jane was lying in the bed, pale and teary-eyed from the medication. David was holding her hand while she whimpered softly. For the first time since I'd met her 5 years ago, I felt genuine sympathy for her. "Don't you worry, sweetie," I said, using the term of endearment she had always rejected before. "We're going to get you the best wheelchair, the most comfortable one you'll need." Jane looked at me with teary eyes and nodded weakly. "Thanks, Alice. It means a lot to me." It was the first time she had called me by my name, without that tone of annoyance she always used. I thought maybe this terrible experience would finally bring us closer. I spent the next few days researching wheelchairs. I talked to physical therapists, read online reviews, and visited specialty stores. I finally found the perfect one. It was an ultralight wheelchair with gel cushions, special all-terrain wheels, and an adjustable backrest. $4,000 exactly, almost everything I had saved for the vacation I had planned with my sister, but it didn't matter. It was for my family. The night we decided to give her the chair was during our monthly family dinner at David's place. It had been 2 weeks since the surgery, and Jane was already home, getting around in a borrowed hospital chair that was clearly uncomfortable. I arrived early to help with dinner, carrying the new wheelchair in my SUV. David helped me get it down, and we hid it in the garage. "Mom, this is too much," he said as he admired the chair. "It must have cost a fortune." "Your wife is worth it," I replied, feeling a genuine warmth. "I want her to be comfortable." Dinner was scheduled for 7. My in-laws, Bob and Patty, arrived first, followed by Jane's sister Kathy, with her husband and their 2 teenage kids. It was a full family gathering, exactly as I had planned for the surprise. Throughout dinner, Jane complained constantly about her current chair. "This thing is awful," she said, shifting uncomfortably. "My back aches, the wheels get stuck, and it's impossible to steer." It was the perfect moment. "Well," I said, wiping my hands with a napkin, "I have something that might help with that." David smiled, knowing what was coming. "Mom has a surprise for you, honey." We all went out to the garage, where David and I unveiled the new chair. Murmurs of admiration filled the space. It was truly beautiful, sleek, and obviously expensive. "My goodness, Alice," Patty said. "That chair must have cost thousands of dollars." $4,000 exactly, I replied proudly. "It has all the features Jane needs. Gel cushions for comfort, all-terrain wheels, a fully adjustable back." Everyone looked at Jane, waiting for her reaction. She stared at the chair for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked me directly in the eyes. "You can keep the chair," she said in a cold voice that cut the air like a knife. I'd rather crawl than owe anything to a cheap old lady. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt as if I'd been slapped. The words replayed in my mind. A cheap old lady, a cheap old lady, a cheap old lady. Then the laughter started. First Kathy, then Bob, and then the teenagers. Even Patty covered her mouth, trying to hide a smile. "Oh, Jane," Kathy laughed, always so direct. David looked mortified. "Jane, Mom was just trying to help." "Help?" Jane laughed bitterly. "Your mother doesn't do anything without an ulterior motive. She probably wants me to feel indebted to her forever." Tears started to sting my eyes, but I wasn't going to cry in front of them. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "I understand," I said in the firmest voice I could muster. "I'll take the chair back." "Mom, no," David started, but Jane cut him off. "Let her, David. Your mother has never understood that we don't need her charity." Charity, as if $4,000 were charity and not love. Bob helped me load the chair back into my SUV without saying a word. When I said goodbye, David followed me to the car. "Mom, I'm so sorry. She's on a lot of pain medication. She's not thinking clearly." But I had seen her eyes when she insulted me. She was completely lucid. I drove home in silence, Jane's words echoing in my head. A cheap old lady, as if 58 years made me a relic, as if my savings were insignificant. That night, as the $4,000 wheelchair sat in my garage, I made a decision. I had installed security cameras in my condo last month after some burglaries in the neighborhood. Tomorrow, I would check the recordings of all the times Jane had been at my place during her recovery. Something didn't sit right about this whole situation, and I had a sinking feeling that I was about to discover exactly what it was. The next morning, I woke up with a headache that had nothing to do with the wine from dinner. Jane's words kept echoing in my mind like a song you can't get out of your head. Cheap old lady, I'd rather crawl. I made my coffee and sat down at the computer in my study. The security camera system I had installed last month was more sophisticated than I initially thought. 4 cameras covered my apartment, 1 at the entrance, 1 in the living room, 1 in the kitchen, and 1 in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I started reviewing the recordings from the last 3 weeks since Jane had been discharged from the hospital. David had brought her over several times for family therapy, as he called it, times when I could supposedly help with her recovery while he was at work. The first recording was from last Tuesday. On the screen, I saw David pushing the hospital wheelchair with Jane sitting in it, looking frail and in pain. He left her in my living room while he went to pick up medications from the pharmacy. "I'll be back in 30 minutes, Mom. Could you keep Jane company?" "Of course, sweetie," I had replied in the recording. I remembered that day perfectly. I had made chamomile tea and sat down to talk with her. Jane had been quiet, responding in monosyllables, occasionally complaining about the pain, a suffering wife, a woman who needed time to heal. But now, watching the recording after I had left the room to answer a phone call in the kitchen, I saw something that made me spill coffee all over my desk. Jane stood up from the wheelchair. It wasn't a shaky movement of someone testing their legs after surgery. It wasn't the trembling attempt of a weak woman trying to reach for something. Jane stood up in a fluid, completely natural movement and walked over to my bookshelf. She walked. With my hands trembling, I rewound the recording and watched it again. There it was, clear as day. Jane wasn't just walking. She was moving with complete normalcy, with no trace of pain or difficulty. She examined my bookshelf, touched some photo frames, and even went to the window to look outside. When she heard my footsteps returning from the kitchen, she hurried back to the wheelchair and resumed her position as the suffering invalid. I felt as if the floor had shifted beneath me. I quickly skipped ahead to the next recording from Friday of the same week. The same scene repeated itself. David left her with me while he went to a work meeting. This time, the moment I went out to the balcony to water my plants, Jane immediately got up. But this time, she wasn't content with just walking around the living room. I saw her head to my kitchen, open drawers, and check cabinets. Her movements were confident, purposeful. There was nothing invalid about the way she bent down to examine the contents of my lower cabinets or how she stretched to reach high shelves. Then I saw her do something that chilled me to the bone. She opened my purse, which was on the kitchen counter, and took out my wallet. With quick, expert movements, she photographed my credit cards with her phone. My phone. The same phone she would later use to complain to David about how the stress of her condition was causing her memory problems. When she finished photographing my cards, she put everything back with the precision of someone who had done this before. She heard my footsteps and rushed back to her chair, assuming the pose of a fragile, pained woman again. I continued reviewing the recordings one by one. In every visit, the same routine. The moment I was gone, Jane transformed from a suffering invalid into a completely functional woman. I saw her going through my mail, photographing important documents, and even trying to open my small safe where I kept some of my mother's jewelry. In one particularly disturbing recording, I saw her in my bedroom, going through my drawers and examining my jewelry box. But the recording that impacted me the most was from last Wednesday. After I had gone to the grocery store, leaving her to rest in the living room, Jane didn't just get up and walk. She put music on her phone and started dancing. She danced like someone who had never had back problems in her life. Fluid movements, spins, even some steps that required considerable flexibility. The woman who was supposedly on the verge of paralysis was dancing like a professional. After dancing for several minutes, she took out her phone and made a call. I turned the volume up to the max to hear what she was saying. "Everything's perfect," she said as she paced my living room. "The old lady is falling for everything. Yeah, the surgery was brilliant. The doctors don't know a thing. They just see what they want to see on the x-rays." A pause while the person on the other end spoke. "No, she doesn't suspect a thing. She's so naive. She even wants to buy me a luxury wheelchair." She laughed, a cruel laugh that I had never heard from her before. "I'm going to tell her I'd rather crawl than accept her charity. It'll be perfect for making her feel guilty." Another pause. "The plan is working exactly as you said. Once I have access to her bank accounts, we can start phase 2. David doesn't suspect a thing. He's too worried about his poor invalid wife." I was paralyzed in front of the screen. She hadn't just been faking her disability. She had been planning this scam from the very beginning. The surgery, the supposed back injury, everything had been an elaborate act. And I had been the fool who had fallen for every lie. I checked the security recordings of my building, which I had access to as a member of the Homeowners Association. There was Jane, arriving at my building on several occasions when she was supposed to be at home recovering. She always arrived walking normally and only got into the wheelchair before ringing my doorbell. The evidence was overwhelming. Jane wasn't a victim of a terrible injury. She was a consummate con artist who had been using my compassion and David's love to execute some kind of sinister plan. As I saved all the recordings to multiple storage devices, one question tormented me. If she was capable of such an elaborate lie, what else was she planning? And more importantly, how deep did this deception go that she had set in motion from the moment she met my son? The next few days passed in a haze of shock and determination. I couldn't focus on anything but the recordings. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jane getting up from that wheelchair with the ease of someone who had never been injured. I decided to install an app on my phone that would allow me to access the cameras in real time. If Jane was going to continue with her act, I would be watching her every move. On Tuesday morning, David called me as usual. "Mom, could you watch Jane this afternoon? I have an important presentation at work and I can't cancel it." "Of course, sweetie," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Bring her over whenever you want." This time, I would be prepared. They arrived at 2 p.m. David looked exhausted, with deep circles under his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. As he helped Jane get settled in the hospital chair, she kept up the perfect act. Soft moans, cautious movements, the expression of someone struggling with constant pain. "Thanks, Mom," David said, kissing my cheek. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Those words hurt more than I expected. My son truly believed he was helping his wife. He had no idea he was being manipulated by an expert liar. After David left, I sat with Jane in the living room. This time, I wasn't going to leave. I wanted to see what she would do when she didn't have the chance to get up. For the first 15 minutes, Jane kept up her act. She complained about the pain. She asked me to adjust the cushions. She commented on how difficult her new reality was. "You don't know how hard this is, Alice," she told me, with tears that seemed genuine. "Sometimes I feel like it would have been better if I had just died on that operating table." What a talented actress. Then my phone rang. It was my sister Carmen calling from Phoenix. Normally I would have ignored the call, but I decided to answer. "Excuse me, Jane. It's my sister. She barely speaks English, so I have to respond in Spanish." Jane nodded understandingly, assuming her suffering invalid pose. I walked toward my room, talking loudly with Carmen about trivial things while watching Jane through the app on my phone. The moment I disappeared from her sight, Jane took out her own phone. "I'm at the old lady's place now," I heard her say in English. I raised the volume of my conversation with Carmen so Jane would think I was completely distracted. "Yeah, she's still as naive as you said," Jane continued, "but we need to accelerate the timeline. David is starting to ask why I'm not getting better faster." There was a pause while the person on the other end spoke. I know. Dr. Martinez played his part perfectly. The fake x-rays were convincing, and David didn't question anything when we told him I needed that exploratory surgery." My blood ran cold. Fake x-rays? Unnecessary surgery? "The will is going to be the tricky part," Jane continued. "I need Alice to trust me enough to consider making changes. David already told me she has properties worth at least $600,000, plus her savings." $600,000. It was a surprisingly accurate figure. How did she know so much about my finances? "The idea that I need long-term special care is going to work," she continued. "David is already talking about maybe we should move here so his mom can help more. Once we're living here, it'll be a lot easier." I felt sick to my stomach. They were planning to move into my house, using my supposed guilt and sympathy to manipulate me into some kind of financial arrangement. "No, she doesn't suspect a thing about the previous visits," Jane said, and her next comment took my breath away. "She's been so busy feeling guilty about not being able to cure me that she hasn't realized I already have copies of her important documents." Copies of my documents? When had she had access to those? "The lawyer you recommended is going to be perfect. Once we convince Alice that she needs to make provisions for my long-term medical care, we can get her to sign everything. David will never question anything if he thinks it's to help me." The conversation continued for several more minutes, revealing details that made me feel physically ill. Apparently, this wasn't the first time Jane had executed this type of scam. There was a network of accomplices: Dr. Martinez, who had falsified medical records, a lawyer willing to prepare fraudulent documents, and someone else who had clearly orchestrated the whole plan. 3 months, Jane finally said. In 3 months, we should have complete access to her accounts. By then, David will be so exhausted from taking care of me that he'll accept any solution we come up with to make our lives easier. When the call ended, I quietly walked back to the living room, where Jane had resumed her pose as a suffering invalid. "How's your sister?" she asked in a weak voice. "She's fine," I replied, struggling to keep my voice normal. "Just wanted to tell me about her grandkids." For the next hour, I watched Jane with new eyes. Every moan, every adjustment in the chair, every expression of pain. It was all a carefully calculated act. This woman wasn't just a liar. She was a predator who had targeted my family as her next victims. When David returned that afternoon, he looked even more exhausted than when he had left. "How was it?" he asked, helping Jane into the car. "It was great," I lied. "We talked a bit. I think these moments together are helping you two connect better." Jane smiled at me from the car. "Alice has been so patient with me. I don't know how I'll ever repay her kindness." David looked relieved. "That's wonderful. Mom, you don't know how much it means to me that you two are developing a better relationship." As I watched them drive away, a cold fury settled in my chest. Jane had been playing with David's emotions, using his love and worry as tools to manipulate him. My son, who worked 60 hours a week to pay for unnecessary medical expenses, who had stopped sleeping from worry, who had considered taking out a loan for Jane's special care. That night, I began my own investigation. If Jane had done this before, she had to have left a trail. I started with simple internet searches. Her full name, her hometown she had mentioned, the places where she had worked before meeting David. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. Jane had been married before, twice in fact. In both cases, there had been mysterious medical problems, significant medical expenses, and in both cases, the marriages had ended after the husband's families had lost considerable amounts of money on treatments and special care. But the most disturbing thing was a newspaper article from a local paper 3 years ago. An elderly woman had filed a complaint against someone who sounded suspiciously like Jane, alleging she had been scammed out of over $100,000 through a fraudulent medical scheme. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence, but the details were chilling in their similarity to what I was witnessing. As I read, I understood that I wasn't just an accidental victim. Jane had chosen me specifically. She had studied my family and calculated exactly how to manipulate our emotions and family dynamics. The question that kept me up all night was simple but terrifying. How many other families had she destroyed before she got to ours? The obsession took over. Over the next few days, my apartment became the headquarters for an investigation that consumed every waking hour. I had printed articles, maps, photographs, and documents I had found online. My dining room table looked like a private detective's office. My sister, Carmen, called me Friday morning. "Alice, you sound awful. Are you sleeping?" "I'm fine," I lied, looking at the dark circles under my eyes in the hallway mirror. "Just a little busy with some things." "Does it have to do with David and his wife?" Carmen had always been perceptive. I decided to trust her, at least partially. "Carmen, I need you to help me with something. Could you look for information on a woman named Jane Smith? I think she has also used the last names Davis and Miller. Why? It's complicated. Just trust me, please." Carmen, bless her heart, didn't ask any more questions. "I'll send you what I find." While I waited for Carmen's response, I decided to do something that scared me. Visit one of Jane's previous victims. The newspaper article mentioned a 72-year-old woman named Evelyn Williams who had lost nearly $100,000 in a fraudulent medical scheme. The article was from 3 years ago, but it had her address from back then. I drove to the neighborhood on Saturday morning. It was an area of modest, well-kept houses, the kind of place where older people live who have worked their whole lives to have a comfortable home in retirement. Evelyn Williams's house had a small front garden full of roses. An elderly woman was watering the plants when I approached. Mrs. Williams? She looked at me cautiously. At 72, she had probably learned to be careful with strangers. Yes, who's asking? My name is Alice Roberts. I think you might have known someone who is now part of my family. Jane Smith. The watering can fell from her hands. My goodness, she whispered. Come in, please, quickly. Evelyn's house was warm and cozy, full of family photos and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. But when she started telling me her story, the warmth disappeared. Jane married my nephew Robert 5 years ago, Evelyn began, serving coffee in delicate porcelain cups. At first, she seemed wonderful, young, beautiful, very attentive to Robert. The story that followed was terribly familiar. 6 months after the wedding, Jane had had an accident that required emergency surgery. The surgery had been successful, but there were complications that required expensive specialized treatments. Robert spent all his savings, Evelyn continued, $50,000 on treatments that insurance didn't cover. When that wasn't enough, she suggested the family should help. And you helped? Evelyn nodded sadly. Robert was like a son to me. His mother, my sister, had died when he was a teenager. I had raised him. When they told me Jane might die without these special treatments. She had sold retirement bonds worth almost $100,000. Did the treatments work? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Of course not. Evelyn laughed bitterly. 6 months later, Jane had a miraculous recovery, but by then she had convinced Robert that he needed to move to a warmer climate for her health. They moved to Arizona with all our money. Did Robert not suspect a thing? Robert was so grateful that she was okay, that he would have done anything she asked. Jane was very clever about how she manipulated his emotions. Evelyn showed me documents she had saved, fake medical bills, receipts for treatments that never existed, even photos of Jane in her wheelchair during that period. The most painful thing, Evelyn said, with tears in her eyes, is that I lost Robert too. When I tried to show him the evidence that he had been scammed, Jane convinced him that I was just jealous of their happiness. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years. I showed Evelyn some of the photos I had found of Jane with David. That's her, she confirmed immediately. She looks exactly the same. Has she started with the medical problems yet? I told her about the supposed back surgery, the wheelchair, everything I had discovered through the security cameras. Evelyn shook her head. It's the exact same pattern. Alice, you have to stop her before she destroys your family like she destroyed mine. When I returned home that afternoon, I had an email from Carmen with information that made my stomach churn. Carmen had found records of 2 other marriages. In the first case, Jane had been married to an older man named Frank Davis. Frank had died in a car accident 2 years after they married, but not before Jane had convinced his family to invest more than $200,000 in a medical business that never existed. The second marriage had been to a widower named Charles Miller, a father of 2 teenage boys. Jane had developed a degenerative disease that required costly treatments. Charles's family had lost their home, helping to pay for the medical expenses. That marriage had ended in divorce when Charles's sons finally convinced their father to investigate the doctors who were treating Jane. 3 families, 3 identical schemes, over $500,000 stolen in total. And now my family was next. That night, as I organized all the evidence I had collected, my phone rang. It was David. Mom, I need to talk to you about something important. My heart sped up. What is it, sweetie? It's about Jane. Her doctor says she's going to need specialized physical therapy that our insurance doesn't fully cover. We're talking about more than $30,000. $30,000. It was exactly what I had expected. And, well, David continued, sounding embarrassed, I was wondering if maybe you could consider helping us. I know it's a lot of money, but Jane says that without this therapy, she could be permanently paralyzed. Permanently paralyzed. What a drama queen. David, I said carefully, have you gotten a second medical opinion? A second opinion? Mom, we trust Dr. Martinez. He's been taking care of Jane from the beginning. I just think with something so serious, it would be prudent. Mom, David interrupted me, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. Jane says you've always doubted her condition. She says you've never truly believed she's as sick as she says. Jane was poisoning my son against me, exactly as she had done with Robert and Charles. That's not true, David. I just want to make sure she's getting the best care possible. Well, are you going to help us or not? The question hung in the air. David, my son who had never spoken to me in that tone before, was being manipulated into pressuring me to give up my money. Let me think about it, I said finally. Think about it? Mom, we're talking about my wife's health. David, I need time to go over my finances. There was a long pause. Okay, but we need an answer soon. The doctor says every day we wait, the damage could become more permanent. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of Jane's crimes. I had the security camera recording showing she could walk perfectly. I had testimonials from previous victims. I had documents that proved she had used multiple identities to scam other families. But my son was so completely under her influence that I might lose him if I didn't handle this perfectly. It was time to develop my own plan. If Jane wanted to play a master manipulator, she was about to find out that she had grossly underestimated this cheap old lady. Revenge is a dish best served cold, the saying goes. But after 3 sleepless nights, planning every detail, my revenge was boiling. On Monday morning, I called David. Honey, I've been thinking a lot about what you told me. I think you're right. You do? The relief in his voice broke my heart. Yes, Jane needs that therapy, and I should be supporting you both more. In fact, I've been thinking that maybe it's time for us to consider some long-term options. What do you mean? Well, David, I'm not going to live forever. I'm 58, and maybe it's time to start making some financial arrangements that can help Jane with her future medical needs. It was exactly what Jane had been waiting to hear, and I knew it. Mom, you don't have to. No, David, I've been selfish. Let me talk to Jane directly about this. I think it's time for us to have an adult conversation about the future. That afternoon, David brought Jane over for what he thought would be a conversation about financial support. What I was actually going to do was a recorded confession. I had spent the morning preparing my apartment like a recording studio. The security cameras were adjusted to capture clear audio from every angle. I had also placed a small digital recorder under the coffee table and another one on the sofa where Jane would sit. When they arrived, Jane kept up her perfect act. David carefully helped her move from the hospital chair to my sofa, where she settled in with soft moans that sounded completely genuine. Alice, Jane said in a weak voice, David told me you wanted to talk to me about something important. Yes, sweetie, but first, David, could you do me a favor? I need you to go to the pharmacy to pick up my blood pressure medication. The prescription is ready. You just have to pay for it. David looked between the two of us. Are you sure? I can go later. No, honey. It's important that Jane and I have this conversation alone. It's woman stuff, about financial planning and medical care. It'll be easier if we can talk freely. David nodded, kissed Jane on the forehead, and thanked me for being so understanding. As he left, I saw a flash in Jane's eyes that confirmed she knew exactly what kind of conversation she was expecting. The moment the door closed, I began my act. "Jane, I need to apologize to you." She tilted her head, maintaining the expression of a suffering woman. "Why, Alice? I've been awful to you since your accident. I know I haven't been the most loving mother-in-law, and when you rejected the wheelchair, well, I realize that you've been trying to maintain your independence, and I've been pressuring you to accept my help." Jane studied me carefully. "You don't have to apologize. I understand you just wanted to help." "No, it's more than that. David has made me see how selfish I've been. I have resources. I have savings. I have properties. And here you are, struggling with this terrible condition. And I've been acting as if my hurt feelings were more important than your health." Jane's eyes began to light up with interest. "David told me about the specialized therapy you need. $30,000 is a lot of money, but it's not impossible for me. Alice, we don't expect you to, but I've also been thinking long term," I interrupted her. "You're young, Jane. You have a whole life ahead of you, and this condition is going to require constant care. David is already working so many extra hours." "That's true," Jane said, and for the first time, her voice sounded less weak. "Sometimes I feel so guilty about all the financial pressure I'm causing." "Exactly. That's why I've been thinking that maybe we should make some more permanent arrangements." Jane straightened up slightly on the sofa. "What kind of arrangements?" "Well, I have this house that's worth about $400,000. I also have investment properties worth another $200,000 and savings of about $150,000. Jane was no longer acting like an invalid. She was sitting completely upright, her eyes calculating numbers. "That's very generous of you to consider. But I've also been thinking about setting up a medical trust," I continued. "Something that guarantees you'll have access to any treatment you need, now and in the future." "A trust?" "Yes. We could transfer most of my assets to a trust that specifically covers your medical expenses. That way, David wouldn't have to worry about working so hard, and you could focus on recovering." Jane had completely forgotten her act now. She stood up from the sofa and started walking back and forth, exactly as she had done in the recordings when she thought I wasn't watching. "That sounds very thoughtful," she said, stopping in front of the window. "Have you talked to any lawyers about this?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, see what you thought." Jane turned to me, and the mask had completely fallen. She was no longer the fragile, suffering woman. She was a predator who had smelled blood. "Alice, I think that's a brilliant idea. It shows that you really understand the seriousness of my condition." "Oh, I understand your condition perfectly," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "You know," Jane continued, walking toward my kitchen as if she owned the place, "I've worked with families before who have set up these kinds of arrangements. There are ways to structure it that are beneficial for everyone." "You've worked with other families?" "Well, yes. Before I met David, I was married before. My first husband had a family who was very generous when I developed my first health problems." "Previous health problems?" Jane laughed, a sound that was anything but weak or painful. "Oh, Alice, I have a long history with complicated medical conditions. Some people are just more susceptible to injuries and illnesses." She walked over to my bookshelf and started examining my family photos exactly as she had done in the recordings when she thought I wasn't looking. "The key," she said with her back to me, "is to work with the right professionals. I know an excellent lawyer who specializes in these kinds of medical trusts. I also work with a financial planner who understands how to structure these things for maximum efficiency. The same professionals you used with your first family? Exactly. Jane turned to me with a smile that was pure greed. Alice, I think we're finally understanding each other. Oh, I think I understand you perfectly. Something in my tone must have alerted her because her smile wavered slightly. In fact, I continued, I understand your condition much better than you think. I walked over to my computer and opened the security camera app. For example, I understand that your condition allows you to dance when you think no one is watching. The screen showed the recording of Jane dancing in my living room last week. I understand that your condition doesn't prevent you from walking all over my house, going through my drawers, and photographing my personal documents. Another recording, this time of Jane stealing information from my wallet. And I understand that your condition is surprisingly selective, considering it only affects you when there are witnesses. Jane had gone pale, but she still tried to maintain control. Alice, can I explain? Oh, but there's more to understand, I said, opening the files I had prepared. I understand that this isn't the first time you've had this condition. Robert Williams, Frank Davis, Charles Miller, 3 previous husbands, 3 scammed families. Now Jane was completely still. I understand that you've stolen over $500,000 from families who trusted you. You can't prove a thing, she said finally, but her voice had lost all confidence. I can't? I pointed to the cameras on my ceiling. It's all on video, Jane. Every lie, every step you've taken when you were supposedly unable to walk, every phone conversation about your plan to scam my family. David will never believe you. Won't he? Well, why don't we ask him? At that moment, as if he had been waiting for his cue, David opened the door. Sorry I took so long. The pharmacy was... He stopped when he saw Jane standing in the middle of the room, clearly not in need of a wheelchair. The shock on his face was absolute. Jane, are you walking? Jane looked between David and me, realizing her carefully constructed world had completely collapsed. David, I can explain. But I was already playing the recordings on my large television, where David could see every lie, every deception, every moment of his wife's betrayal. My son collapsed into a chair, watching in disbelief at the woman who had been manipulating his love and compassion for months. Who are you really? He whispered. Jane didn't respond. She had no more lies to tell. The silence in my living room was so thick I could hear the ticking of the clock I had inherited from my mother. David was still sitting in the chair, watching the recordings playing on the TV as if he were watching a horror movie starring his own life. Jane, for her part, had gone through the 5 stages of grief in a matter of minutes. Denial had vanished when David saw her walking. Anger had appeared briefly when she tried to blame me for spying on her. Bargaining had lasted exactly 30 seconds when she tried to convince David that it was all a misunderstanding. Depression had set in when she realized the recordings were irrefutable. Now she was in the acceptance stage, but her version of acceptance was planning her escape. David, she said finally, her voice no longer weak or suffering, you need to understand that your mother is insane. These recordings are taken out of context. My son turned to her slowly, as if he were looking at a stranger. Taken out of context? Jane, I saw you dancing on the screen. I saw you walking as if you'd never been injured. The pain medication sometimes gives me enough energy to... Stop! David stood up so abruptly that his chair toppled over. Stop with the lies already. It was the first time in my life I had seen my son truly furious. David had inherited my calm temperament. He always preferred diplomacy over confrontation. But now, seeing how he had been manipulated, his face was red with anger. How long? He asked, his voice shaking. How long have you been lying about everything? Jane looked at him, calculating if she still had any chance of regaining control. She decided to try one last approach, victimization. David, your mother set me up. She drugged me or something because I don't remember doing half the things in these videos. It was the wrong move. My mother drugged you? David laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Jane, there are dozens of hours of recordings that show exactly who you really are. I walked to my filing cabinet and took out the folder I had prepared. David, there's more you need to know. I handed him copies of the articles about Jane's previous marriages, the testimonials from Evelyn Williams, and the searches Carmen had done on her multiple identities. As David read, his expression changed from anger to utter shock. You've been married 3 times before? Jane finally dropped all pretense. So what? It's not illegal to get married multiple times. But it is illegal to scam your husband's families, I said calmly. You don't have proof of any scams. I smiled and took out my phone. I don't? I played the recording of the phone conversation I had captured when Jane thought I was talking to my sister. Her voice filled the room, discussing fake x-rays, Dr. Martinez, and the plans to access my $600,000. When the recording ended, David looked physically ill. Doctor, Martinez is involved in this? Completely, I replied. I've been investigating. The x-rays they showed you were taken from another patient. Your health insurance is already investigating the fraudulent bills. Jane finally lost her composure completely. This is ridiculous. You can't prove anything. They're just recordings taken out of context and conspiracy theories from a paranoid old woman. Paranoid old woman. This time, I was the one who laughed. Jane, I have documentation of everything. Every fraudulent bank transfer, every fake medical bill, every lie you've told. I took the last document from my folder, including her marriage certificate to Frank Davis, who died mysteriously 2 months after his family invested $200,000 in her medical business. Jane's face went white as a sheet. David looked at the document, then at Jane, then back at the document. Frank died. How? Car accident, I said. Very convenient, considering he had started asking questions about where his family's money had gone. Are you implying that Jane began. I'm not implying anything. I'm just presenting facts. I took out my phone again and dialed a number I had programmed that morning. Detective Morrison, this is Alice Roberts. I have that evidence we talked about. Jane headed for the door, but David blocked her way. You're not going anywhere until this is sorted out. You can't hold me here. Technically, I said, hanging up the phone, no one is holding you, but Detective Morrison is on his way, and I think he'd like to talk to you about several open investigations. Jane collapsed on the sofa, finally defeated. David, she said, making one last desperate attempt, you still love me, right? We can fix this. We can start over. My son looked at her for a long moment, and I saw years of manipulation and lies finally crystallize into complete understanding. No, he said simply, I don't love you. I don't know if I ever loved you or if I just loved the person you pretended to be. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, Jane had tried to destroy her phone, but David had taken it from her before she could complete the task. Detective Morrison was an older man with kind but sharp eyes that had seen too much in his career. Mrs. Roberts, this evidence is extraordinary. We've been investigating a pattern of medical scams in the area for years, but we've never had such complete documentation. As he reviewed the recordings and documents, Jane remained sitting in silence, knowing that anything she said would only make her situation worse. What happens now? David asked. Well, we have evidence of multiple crimes, the detective explained. Medical fraud, forgery, identity theft, and possibly a lot more. The lady, or should I say the woman you know as Jane, is going to be busy with the legal system for a long time. When they led Jane away in handcuffs, she didn't look back once. David and I were left alone in my apartment, surrounded by evidence of months of lies and manipulation. "Mom," he said finally, his voice breaking, "I am so sorry. You have nothing to apologize for, sweetie." "Yes, I do. I treated you horribly. I pressured you to give her money. I made you feel guilty for not trusting her." I walked over to my son and hugged him for the first time in months. "David, she was a professional. This is what she does for a living. Manipulate people's emotions. Use their love against them. How did I not see it? How could I have been so blind? Because you love with all your heart, just like your father did. It's a beautiful quality, but sometimes bad people take advantage of that goodness." We spent the next few hours talking, really talking, for the first time since Jane had entered our lives. David told me about the pressures he had felt, about how Jane had been so skilled at manipulating every situation to make him feel guilty for any doubts he had. She would tell me that if I really loved her, I wouldn't question her pain, he explained. And when I suggested getting a second medical opinion, she cried for hours about how I didn't trust her. 3 months later, the true extent of Jane's crimes had come to light. Detective Morrison kept me informed about the investigation. She had used at least 5 different identities over the past 10 years. She had scammed 8 families that they could prove, stealing a total of over $1.2 million. Dr. Martinez had lost his medical license and was facing criminal charges for his involvement in multiple fraudulent billing schemes. The lawyer who had been preparing fraudulent documents had also been arrested. David had filed for divorce immediately. It turned out that even their marriage had been a sham. Jane was already married to another victim in another state. The $4,000 wheelchair that was still in my garage, I donated to a local hospital. It gave me a deep satisfaction to know that someone who truly needed it would be using it. But the real healing came in the following months, as David and I rebuilt our relationship. Family dinners were once again happy occasions. David was once again the loving, attentive son he had been before Jane had poisoned him against me. 6 months after the arrest, I received a letter from Evelyn Williams. "Dear Alice," she wrote, "you don't know what it means to me to know that someone finally stopped that woman. My nephew, Robert, has finally contacted me. Jane had told him that I had died. We're planning to get together next month. Thank you for giving me my family back." It was a Saturday afternoon when David came to visit, bringing fresh flowers and coffee from my favorite coffee shop. "You know what the craziest thing about all of this is?" he said as we sat on my balcony. "What?" "That in the end, the cameras you installed to protect yourself from burglars ended up protecting us from something much worse." I looked toward my living room, where the security cameras were still discreetly mounted in the corners. "Sometimes the best protection is simply the truth," I told him. David nodded, taking my hand. "Mom, promise me something." "What?" "If I ever bring anyone home who gives you a bad feeling, don't be polite about it. Just tell me directly." I laughed, feeling a lightness I hadn't experienced in months. "Honey, after all this, you can be sure that I'm never going to keep quiet again when something doesn't feel right." As the sun set over the city, I realized I had learned a valuable lesson from this whole experience. At 58, I discovered it was never too late to stand up for yourself and the people you love. And sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting back at those who have hurt you. The best revenge is simply making sure they can't hurt anyone else. The wheelchair was gone, Jane was gone, but my family, my real family, was stronger than ever, and that was worth far more than $4,000.